So Donald Trump just cornered the one ally he thought he could bully without consequence. And for the first time in his political life, he blinked. But here's the thing. The damage is already done. We are watching the complete collapse of a tough guy gamble that was doomed from the start. The White House operated on the arrogant assumption that Canada would eventually fold once the pressure got loud enough. They banked everything on the idea that fear alone would force Ottawa to tear up its own position and beg for relief. But guess what? That gamble has backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. Instead of submission, Trump has been met with a wall of cold, hard competence. And it has exposed his operation as chaotic, unprepared, and completely out of its depth. It's honestly hard to believe he thought this would work. We are talking about a G7 nation, not a disposable pawn in one man's ego trip. This isn't just about trade rhetoric or campaign theatrics. We are talking about the United States proving to the world that its word no longer means anything. Let me fill you in on what's been happening. So let's look at the setup here. Trump returned to power carrying resentment, not a roadmap. He came back obsessed with proving that America first still meant domination, still meant forcing someone else to absorb the shock so he could look strong on camera. Stability was never the goal. Confrontation was. Trump didn't have data. Trump didn't have a plan. Trump didn't have patience. What he had was grievance, instinct, and a reflex to escalate whenever attention started drifting away from him. He needed a villain that could activate MAGA Republicans without risking an immediate backlash at home. He didn't choose Canada because of wrongdoing. He chose Canada because it was convenient, visible, and emotionally useful. A neighbor close enough to threaten, familiar enough to humiliate, important enough to matter, whether it was trade agreements turned into weapons, or allies treated as disposable leverage, or public pressure campaigns designed to extract obedience, the pattern never changed. Whether it was threats framed as negotiations, or deadlines used as intimidation, or loyalty tests disguised as diplomacy, the same playbook kept reappearing. Fear first, demands next, submission as the desired ending. But this time, the assumption broke. Canada didn't improvise. Canada didn't panic. Canada didn't wait to see how bad it might get. They knew Trump would come back. They knew he would be aggressive. And they built a strategy designed to neutralize his chaos with boring, relentless stability. Trump escalated anyway. Louder statements, sharper language, more pressure. He believed the response would be frantic calls, rushed concessions, and public anxiety. He expected movement toward surrender. What he ran into instead was discipline, measured responses, coordinated messaging, no emotional flailing, no rushed compromises, the kind of reaction that gives chaos nothing to feed on. The White House hesitated, not because Canada overreacted, but because Canada refused to. And while Trump performed strength for the cameras, the consequences slid quietly toward ordinary Americans. Workers caught between slogans and reality, shifts questioned, contracts delayed, job security shaken at the edges, not because of an unavoidable crisis, but because Trump chose a fight that looked theatrical on television and destructive everywhere else. At first glance, this looks like just another clash of personalities. But if you zoom out, a very specific pattern snaps into focus. It always begins the same way. Someone steps forward in good faith, convinced that proximity to Trump offers influence, relevance, or protection. They defend him on television. They absorb criticism on his behalf. They translate his impulses into something that looks almost normal. For a moment, loyalty feels rewarded, doors stay open, access is granted, the alliance looks functional. Think about that. Then the line appears, quietly at first. A request that pushes past procedure. A demand that ignores law. A moment where doing the right thing would mean saying no. And that is where the story changes. The moment someone refuses to cross that line, the atmosphere turns. The patience evaporates. The tone hardens. The expectation becomes absolute obedience, not cooperation. Trump does not negotiate with limits. He attacks them. He ridicules the refusal. He reframes restraint as betrayal. What was once loyalty is instantly recast as weakness or disloyalty. Public insults replace private conversations. Pressure becomes humiliation. Isolation follows. The message was clear. Loyalty to Trump supersedes loyalty to the law. And then it happens again. Another figure enters the orbit, convinced they can manage him, moderate him, or redirect him. They believe proximity equals control. They speak carefully. They protect him from himself. They tell others to be patient, to trust the process. For a brief window, Trump rewards that devotion with access and validation. It looks like partnership until the moment arrives where restraint is required. A legal boundary, an institutional norm, a request that would cross into the indefensible. When the answer is no, Trump responds the same way every time. The refusal is personalized. The individual is attacked, not the argument. Motives are questioned. Loyalty is revoked. The public spectacle begins. Careers are burned as warnings. The message was clear. Loyalty to Trump supersedes loyalty to the law. And this wasn't the last time. The pattern extends beyond individuals. Entire institutions are pulled into the same trap. They begin with cooperation, assuming mutual interest still matters. They offer flexibility. They absorb insults. They attempt to de-escalate. For a moment, Trump treats that as weakness. He pushes harder. He demands more. He expects submission. When the institution holds its ground, the retaliation follows. Public attacks, accusations of sabotage, claims of corruption. The refusal to bend is reframed as hostility. The goal isn't resolution, it's domination. Anyone who resists becomes an enemy by definition. The message was clear. Loyalty to Trump supersedes loyalty to the law. Once you see this pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee. Anyone who refuses to cross the line is disposable. And that is the rule governing power inside Trump's world. What Trump did next was a moral inversion so blatant it should have set off alarms immediately. An ally that refused to break rules was no longer treated as a partner. It was rebranded as an obstacle. Cooperation became obstruction. Restraint became hostility. The refusal to cross legal and institutional boundaries was reframed as betrayal. In Trump's worldview, the moment someone refuses to bend reality for him, they stop being an ally and start becoming a target. This is where the collision between rules and vandalism becomes impossible to ignore. Canada stayed inside the framework. Agreements, procedures, norms, and expectations that the United States itself helped construct were treated as binding commitments. Trump, on the other hand, treated those same structures as disposable the second they stopped delivering instant leverage. When the rules no longer served him, he didn't renegotiate them, he attacked them. He treated law as inconvenience and predictability as weakness. That's not strategy. That's vandalism dressed up as toughness. The reaction didn't stay abstract. It bled into the real economy and the real electorate almost immediately. Businesses didn't need policy briefings to sense the instability. They felt it in delayed decisions, paused investments, and conversations that suddenly went quiet. Markets froze in place, not because of data, but because of uncertainty. Voters felt the anxiety creep in. Workers started wondering whether overtime would last, whether contracts would hold, whether jobs would still be there when the noise faded. This is how instability announces itself, not with explosions, but with hesitation. Think about that. What Trump didn't anticipate was how directly this would boomerang back onto his most carefully constructed image. The economic strongman persona depends on a simple illusion, that chaos comes from outside forces and order comes from him. This episode shattered that illusion. The volatility wasn't imported. It was self-generated. The instability didn't arrive from a hostile actor. It came from the White House. The man claiming to protect American workers was actively injecting risk into their lives. And once that becomes visible, the brand begins to rot from the inside. And this is where Trump trapped himself in a no-win box with no clean escape. If Trump chooses escalation, the damage compounds. Economic anxiety deepens. Business confidence erodes further. Donors grow nervous as unpredictability threatens long-term planning. Voters feel the consequences not as headlines, but as stress, insecurity, and stalled opportunity. The longer the escalation lasts, the clearer it becomes that the cost is being paid domestically, not by the supposed enemy. If Trump chooses retreat, the performance collapses. The threat is exposed as a bluff. MAGA Republicans don't see strategic recalibration. They see weakness. The aura of dominance cracks. The image of control evaporates. The retreat confirms that the pressure politics failed, and that realization spreads fast through a base trained to worship strength above all else. There is no third door. There is no scenario where Trump walks away looking decisive, victorious, and in control. Every available path extracts a price, and every price is political. Inside the Republican Party, the fracture becomes impossible to paper over. The business wing wants predictability and access to stable markets. MAGA loyalists want spectacle, escalation, and domination, regardless of cost. Moderates want distance from chaos they know voters will punish. These factions are no longer moving in the same direction. They are pulling against each other. The party stalls, unable to advance and unable to retreat, locked in a paralysis created by Trump's refusal to accept limits. And that paralysis is the point where systems start to strain. What changed the trajectory wasn't another press conference or another threat. It was the moment a formal institution stepped into the frame and made it clear this was no longer just political theater. This wasn't Trump arguing with an ally. This was a governing system reacting to behavior that had crossed from aggressive politics into something far more dangerous. Once institutions enter, the fight stops being personal, it becomes structural. The core issue was executive overreach. Trump framed his actions as necessity, urgency, even emergency, leaning on the familiar language he uses whenever he wants to bypass resistance. Congress was inconvenient. Process was slow. Oversight was framed as weakness. So power had to move faster, louder, and with fewer constraints. That justification has always been his favorite shortcut. It allows him to act first and dare the system to stop him later. But this time, the system didn't defer. Courts are often cautious when presidents invoke national interest or security. Deference is the norm. Hesitation is expected. But when the reasoning becomes this thin, when the logic collapses under its own weight, restraint disappears. The judiciary didn't rush to defend Trump's posture. It examined it, and the cracks were obvious. That's the moment the tone shifted. Let that sink in. What followed was just as destabilizing for Trump. Conservative legal voices, the ones he relies on for legitimacy, didn't line up behind him. They didn't need to agree with Canada. They didn't need to support Democrats. They simply recognized the danger. A presidency that treats law as optional becomes a threat to everyone once the precedent stands. When conservative institutions begin to pull away, the insulation Trump depends on starts to fail. At the center of all this is the constitutional fault line Trump keeps testing. Executive power versus legislative authority. Speed versus accountability. If a president can manufacture urgency to override Congress whenever resistance appears, then separation of powers becomes decorative. The question stops being about one decision and becomes about whether the architecture of governance still functions. This isn't abstract. This is the axis everything rests on. The domestic fallout followed quickly. Confidence weakened, not in one dramatic collapse, but in a slow erosion. Investors hesitate when rules feel temporary. Businesses delay when signals contradict each other. Consumers sense instability even if they can't articulate it. Elections become volatile when trust thins out. None of this requires numbers to feel real. It shows up in behavior. And behavior changes before narratives do. The deeper problem Trump created is one of legitimacy. When institutions push back and the presidency resists correction, the question becomes unavoidable. If the executive refuses limits and the system allows it, what exactly is the presidency anymore? Is it an office bound by law or a platform powered by spectacle and pressure? If this behavior stands, what stops the next president from going further? This is where the frame has to shift completely, because pretending this was ever just about trade or Canada or a single dispute is a deliberate misunderstanding. What we are witnessing is a clash between rules and raw power, governance versus impulse. A serious nation being stress-tested by a reality TV presidency that treats limits as personal insults. Think about that. Donald Trump has always struggled with boundaries. He hates delay. He resents procedure. He interprets restraint as weakness and patience as failure. Anything that slows him down feels illegitimate. Anything that requires coordination instead of domination feels like sabotage. He does not merely dislike limits, he experiences them as humiliation. That is why courts frustrate him. That is why Congress irritates him. That is why allies who refuse to bend become enemies overnight. Limits expose what he cannot control, and that is intolerable to him. This is where the warning becomes larger than Trump himself. If behavior like this is normalized, it does not remain an exception. If it is accepted once, it becomes precedent. If it becomes precedent, it does not vanish when Trump leaves the stage. And once it survives him, it becomes available to the next leader who wants to move faster, push harder, and ignore constraints with even greater confidence. That chain is not speculative. That is how institutional erosion actually works. First, an abuse is justified as necessary. Then it is defended as effective. Then it is repeated without apology. Finally, it is inherited. By the time the public realizes something fundamental has changed, the behavior no longer feels shocking. It feels familiar. And that familiarity is the danger. This is how democratic decay advances, not with tanks or sudden collapse, but through normalization. Norms weaken because outrage exhausts itself. Boundaries blur because people adapt. What once would have been unacceptable becomes merely controversial. What was controversial becomes routine. The system doesn't fail in one dramatic moment. It thins. It stretches. It loses the ability to correct itself because the public has been conditioned to expect dysfunction as the baseline. And this is where ordinary voters re-enter the picture, whether Trump wants them to or not. Popular politics still obeys gravity. Voters may tolerate aggression, they may even cheer disruption, but they do not reward sustained incompetence. They do not live comfortably inside chaos. When unpredictability reaches paychecks, prices, jobs, and long-term security, spectacle stops being entertaining. It becomes exhausting. Be honest. This is not a partisan instinct. It is a human one. People want stability. They want rules they can plan around. They want leaders who reduce uncertainty, not amplify it. Trump's style offers constant motion without control, pressure without resolution, escalation without an exit. That energy may energize a base in the short term, but it corrodes confidence over time. And confidence is what economies, alliances, and democracies actually run on. The deeper choice underneath all of this is civilizational, not electoral. It is the difference between a nation that governs itself through rules and a state that performs itself through spectacle, between institutions that constrain leaders and leaders who consume institutions, between seriousness and permanent improvisation. One path demands patience, coordination, and humility. The other demands attention, dominance, and endless conflict. Trump embodies the second path completely, not as an accident, but as a philosophy. He does not see governance as stewardship. He sees it as conquest. He does not see institutions as safeguards. He sees them as obstacles. And when that worldview is allowed to shape precedent, the damage outlives the individual. That is why this moment does not end with a single confrontation or a single court decision. The legal battles are only beginning. The institutional pushback is still forming. The economic consequences are only starting to reach everyday life. Trust, once shaken, takes time to rebuild. Stability, once broken, does not snap back instantly. The temperature is rising, not cooling. The system is responding, but the test is ongoing. The outcome is not settled. What is at stake is not a policy win or loss, but whether governance still means something more than performance. This story is still unfolding. The consequences are still spreading. And the choice between rules and raw power has not yet been resolved.